In the Middle Ages, gold was not just a necessary medium of exchange. It was the lifeblood of kingdoms, the reason empires survived. However, in the Middle Ages, justice was determined by divine laws, and in church laws, lending gold with interest had a price. The eternal condemnation of the soul to darkness, and the absolute liquidation of the body. The church called this usury, and its punishment was not only ostracization in this world, but being condemned to eternal suffering in the afterlife. The devout public feared this situation, and merchants avoided interest, fearing to oppose the church. But a rising family in Florence was about to turn this fear into a financial leverage. So, how did an ordinary family rising from the foggy, damp-smelling back streets of Florence turn the interest-bearing debt system into a stepping stone to the world's greatest wealth despite these strict divine laws? Did the Medicis actually invent that flawless Renaissance we admire with awe in museums today for a massive money laundering operation? Were those divine brushstrokes of the artists a golden curtain covering a dirty financial architecture? Or were the women who posed for hours for those magnificent paintings and statues actually flawless data miners, infiltrating the most intimate borders of European palaces behind aesthetics, logging the weaknesses of kings into forbidden ledgers? How did the Medicis build history's first global blackmail network through bedroom diplomacy? In this episode, we decode step by step how a cleverly constructed money empire infiltrated the impenetrable deep archives of the Vatican. We will examine how they turned the entire wealth of the Holy Authority into a central bank by placing a former bloody pirate onto the Holy See. You will see how they legitimized forbidden interest through a flawless exchange rate illusion. That is, how they turned sin into an algorithm. This is not just the dusty history of a family. It is the greatest tale of financial cunning in medieval history, encompassing religion, money, and limitless power. If you are ready, meet the gods' bankers. Welcome to the mysterious pages of the Golden Throne's archive. In medieval Europe, armies drew kingdom borders, but only one thing kept those armies standing: gold. At that time, money had a homeland, a physical weight, and above all, a divine identity. However, in the dim bank offices of Florence, the Medici family had found a way to stateless money, to strip it of sacred laws and turn it into a ghost. Do you know the origins of the SWIFT network, through which trillions of dollars move across continents in seconds today? Or borderless crypto wallets? Or untraceable offshore accounts? The answer to this question lies in those first cleverly crafted bills of exchange on Giovanni de' Medici's wooden desk in the 15th century. The laws of the church were sharp. Loaning money and asking for interest meant stealing time created by God. The church called this time theft, and its punishment was absolute excommunication, meaning both commercial and spiritual liquidation. So, How would a banker profit from the public's desperation? Without throwing his soul into the flames, Giovanni de' Medici used a flawless mathematical illusion, not a sword, to break this divine law. He named the system Cambio, meaning foreign exchange. The mechanics of the system were as cold and analytical as today's complex derivatives markets. Does a wool merchant in Florence need immediate liquidity? The Medici bank would never give him a loan with interest. Instead, Florentine gold was taken from the merchant, and in return, a piece of paper, a bill of exchange, was given. According to the agreement, this merchant had to repay the money he received months later at a Medici branch in London or Paris, entirely as a different currency, such as the British pound or the French franc. On paper, everything was flawless. Everything was legal, compliant enough with sacred protocols to satisfy the church's auditors. There was no interest involved. There was only a natural exchange transaction between the currencies of two different countries. But what was hidden in the invisible columns of those parchments, right at the heart of the exchange rate difference, was history's largest and most systematic operation of cunning. Medici bankers manipulated the exchange rates of the coming months in their favor, to such an extent that the wide spread in between was the very interest the church had forbidden. They had turned sin into a financial algorithm under the name of exchange difference. This was no ordinary banking activity. This was the construction of history's first offshore system. Money no longer fell into the ambushes of bandits on dangerous trade routes. It did not physically cross borders. The only thing transported from Paris to Florence were encrypted messages passing from one courier to another. Only the ink in the Medici ledgers changed places. You know that dark accounting conducted in tax havens by today's massive asset management companies and Silicon Valley tech giants. That invisible architecture was actually coded in Giovanni's parchments illuminated by candlelight 600 years ago. Money had an owner, yes, but it no longer had a traceable footprint. The Medicis didn't just get rich by turning money from a physical object into information. They established an unaccountable shadow authority, completely independent of the control of states, kings, and bishops. However, they couldn't grease this massive machine with gold alone. Hiding gold in vaults was easy. The real issue was protecting this immense power created by that gold. To protect power, they needed information, and to gather information, they would use humanity's oldest, weakest point: vulnerabilities. The construction of great empires doesn't always happen in the marble halls of kings. Sometimes the invoice for that grandeur is issued at a wooden loom, in a small shop in the narrow, dark, wet, and urine-scented back streets of Florence. As Matteo wiped the dripping sweat from his forehead with his arm, he thought the bill of exchange he received from the Medici bank that day was the only guiding light in his dark life. He had to bring raw wool from England, and urgently needed gold to keep the looms running. That silk-robed, cold-faced clerk at the Medici branch hadn't given him a loan. With a slight smile on his lips, he had merely performed a exchange rate. Matteo had taken Florentine gold and gratefully agreed to make the payment in London as British pounds 6 months later. He slept peacefully that night. He believed he hadn't tainted himself with the sinful fire of interest and had saved his family's livelihood without selling his soul to the devil. After all, the church had blessed this transaction, and that great bank had funded the church. Until 6 months later, when that bill matured. There was a truth written in small print behind those parchments that Matteo, who could barely read, didn't know. The Medici algorithms had already run, and within those 6 months, the Medicis had lent heavily to the market. They had ruthlessly manipulated the silver and gold supply across Europe under the table. When it was time to make the payment to the London branch, the value of the British pound had been so horribly depreciated against the florin that innocent exchange Matteo took had suddenly turned into a loan with 40% interest due to the exchange rate difference. When the Medici debt collectors arrived at the door, they held no swords, nor was there anger on their faces. They merely held a black ledger and a completely legal liquidation document sealed by the church. Matteo begged, but the system had no mercy. It only had mathematics. In seconds, he lost the weaving looms left by his father, the wool in his warehouse, and the deed to that damp shop. When Matteo was thrown onto the streets of Florence that day, he still couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. He had been skinned alive, yet there was neither a thief nor a drawn dagger in sight. He couldn't blame the system because everything was legal and sacred. This was the true face of the exchange rate difference. For a street wool merchant, this was absolute annihilation. For the Medici ledgers, it was a new physical asset transaction added to the balance sheet and seized for free. However, liquidating an ordinary merchant was just a warm-up lap for this massive wheel. The real target was to liquidate dukes with armies, princes with castles, and kings with borders. And for this, they needed a weapon far deadlier and much more elegant than a simple currency manipulation. Those flawless weapons hiding behind aesthetics, adorning the walls of museums. Crushing simple merchants in the street were income items too small to be a target for the Medicis. The real battlefield wasn't the bloody squares where armors were worn. It was those perfume-scented palace halls where silk sheets, heavy wine goblets, and priceless art reigned. Those flawless Renaissance paintings and marble statues you admire in museums today. Do you think they were made purely for art? Look again. Those naked female figures adorning the walls of massive cathedrals and decorating the palaces of nobles. They weren't just models. They were the sharpest and most dangerous field agents of the Medici intelligence network. During the Renaissance, having nude female statues or paintings commissioned for nobles' homes was the ultimate status symbol. However, The Medicis turned this innocent aesthetic passion of power-drunk aristocrats into a flawless operational field. The models chosen for the paintings weren't there just for their divine beauty. They were specially selected, trained spies bound to the system with absolute loyalty. Completing a painting took weeks, sometimes months. During this process, the artist and the model beside him would settle into that noble's palace. This was a normal procedure for artists and hosts at the time. Everything on stage was enchanting. Dukes and princes watched this masterpiece being created before their eyes with admiration, having the best wines in their cellars opened for the guests watching the feast. However, as the artist's brush gently glided across the canvas, the model's eyes and ears were roaming the most intimate corridors of the palace. The mind working behind that body, remaining motionless for hours, was actually a massive algorithm. The model's inner voice wasn't just thinking about her tiring muscles at that moment. She was step by step coding the seals on the open parchments on the Duke's desk, the panic on the sweaty faces of entering envoys, and the whispered arguments the Duke had with his treasurer. During the painting sessions, and even after they ended, these women used their charm to infiltrate the bedrooms of the householders, dukes, and princes. These actions weren't a simple carnal passion. It was a flawless, hedonistic manipulation, and an effort to make the target a slave to his desires. These kinds of espionage activities, conducted by the Medicis using women, were history's most successful example of bedroom diplomacy. Rising to the position of mistresses, these models reported the information gathered in midnight whispers directly to the Medici branches. During the time spent on silk pillows, the answers to the real questions were sought over these beautiful and lustful female spies' targets. Which duke is seeking funding for his army? Which princess is cheating on her husband, and with whom? Who is the king on the brink of bankruptcy? Which aristocrat wants a naked female painting commissioned for his house? Art provided a perfect legal cover for this espionage activity. The nobles never realized that these women they hosted in their homes were actually data miners of the Medicis. They were lost in the arrogance of a conqueror, an art patron. Just as the algorithms that track our digital footprints in today's world, those models in Renaissance palaces were the exact same thing for the Medicis. They were a living intelligence network collecting the darkest secrets and deepest vulnerabilities of those in power. The brushstrokes of Michelangelo or Botticelli were actually a colorful curtain covering Europe's largest blackmail archive. Art was aesthetic, yes. But for the Medici, art was absolute intelligence power. And every piece of information torn by lustful models from those dark bedrooms, every leaked document, these priceless data were masterfully processed. They flowed directly to Florence and were logged into those black-bound forbidden ledgers that no one was supposed to see, to be transformed into a masterfully crafted weapon of blackmail and liquidation. When the young and ambitious sculptor Michelangelo received an invitation from Cardinal Raffaele Riario, one of the most powerful men in Rome, He thought it was merely a reward for his artistic genius. Michelangelo knew well that this new job would be a very important stepping stone for his career, and he immediately put out an ad that he needed a flawless model for a new piece. That brunette, sharp-eyed, and enchanting woman who knocked on his studio door, Isabella, was a blessing from God for him. But there was a very dark truth the young artist didn't know. Isabella, who immediately responded to the ad, hadn't knocked on that door by chance that day. The intelligence that Cardinal Riario would commission an artwork for his palace had fallen into the Medici's shadow post network months ago. Isabella was a flawless spy candidate, specially trained for this operation, dressed according to Michelangelo's aesthetic vulnerabilities, and directed to that very door by the Medicis themselves. Looking at this brunette spy as beautiful as a goddess, the artist thought he would sculpt the statue. Isabella, however, had already sculpted the artist with her charm and taken Michelangelo into the palm of her hand as a Trojan horse to infiltrate Riario's palace. The game began when the duo settled into the Cardinal's massive palace in Rome. During the days, everything was about aesthetics. Isabella spent hours on those cold marbles, striking those bold poses as her muscles trembled. Her body went numb from exhaustion, but she was used to it, and her mind worked like a flawless algorithm. During those hours-long sessions, Cardinal Riario would come to watch this beautiful model with pleasure. Sipping his wine, Isabella instantly noticed the hunger in the Cardinal's eyes. From that moment on, the intimate diplomacy protocol was activated. Her eyes narrowing slightly, that innocent yet inviting smile on her lips. These weren't coincidences. They were hedonistic investments meant to collapse the Cardinal's mental defenses. Isabella took the man's arrogance and vulnerabilities into the palm of her hand, step by step. At the end of the third week, when the palace fell into a deep sleep, Isabella got out of bed. She draped the silk cover over her shoulders like a shadow. She was no longer a model, but an information spy. With silent, bare feet, she moved through the intimate corridors of the palace. Her target was the Cardinal's study. When she infiltrated, the desk was covered with parchments. In that dim room lit by moonlight, it took her only seconds to find what she was looking for. A black, leather-bound ledger bearing the personal seal of Cardinal Riario. This contained the financing records of a secret mercenary army to be assembled against Florence. As Isabella etched the numbers and names beneath the document into her mind, footsteps echoed in the corridor. Someone was approaching. Isabella held her breath, silently placing the parchment back. Her ribcage felt as if it would burst, but her facial expression remained completely cold-blooded. If caught, the price would be certain execution. At best, she would be sent off to silence in the dungeons of the Vatican. The door handle slowly pressed down. Isabella glided like a cat behind the heavy velvet curtains in the darkest corner of the room. The person who entered, holding a candle and suffering from insomnia, was none other than Cardinal Riario himself. The man went to his desk and poured a glass of wine. Just 2 meters away, behind the curtain, Isabella could hear every breath the man took. Her stomach churned with adrenaline. But the information she held was worth more than hundreds of thousands of gold pieces. When the cardinal left the room half an hour later, Isabella emerged from the darkness and returned to her spot on the marble platform to strike her bold pose with the first light of morning. The masterpiece Michelangelo created as he left that palace is still exhibited in museums today. But the true masterpiece was the flawless intelligence operation Isabella stole that night, which was logged into the forbidden ledgers in Florence, destroying an enemy army before it was even born. The encrypted numbers and the cardinal's secret military plans that Isabella etched into her mind in that dim study were no longer an ordinary intelligence report once they left the dark streets of Rome and reached Florence via the Shadow Post network. That data had entered the center of the Medici bank to be transformed into the world's deadliest weapon. This intimate information gathered was silently processed in the central bank in Florence. The double-entry bookkeeping system invented by the Medicis didn't just record the movement of gold and silver or simple numbers. In the invisible secret columns of those heavy black-bound ledgers, the sins of the European aristocracy, kings and dukes, were written. This archive, which history calls the Forbidden Ledgers, was the most flawless blackmail database history had ever seen. Think about it. When the due date arrived for a covert loan a king took to spend on his mistress or to raise a secret army, Medici debt collectors never asked him for gold. Through their spies or algorithms, they had already calculated the exact moment the money couldn't be repaid in advance. When the king sat at the table in despair, intimate documents similar to what Isabella stole were placed before him. Medici demanded much more valuable assets instead of gold. A strategic mining concession, customs rights to an important port, or state approval for a political assassination against a rival aristocratic family. Information was a much sharper, far more ruthless weapon than gold, because gold would eventually run out, but the term of blackmail lasted forever. As long as the debtor's body lived, his soul was under the Medici's emotional property. Does this dark blackmail mechanism sound familiar to you today? Today, those intimate data collected about us by tech giants, massive algorithms, or data brokers actually serve the exact same purpose as the data collected by those model spies in the 15th century. Absolute control. While we willingly leave our digital footprints, they were logging these prints into their own blackmail ledgers. The Medicis established an unaccountable and limitless center of power above states, without taking command of any army, without entering any war directly. They were the BlackRock or JP Morgan of today's massive investment funds, but they possessed a much more dangerous, much more insidious instrument. The key to the human soul and its vulnerabilities. But these ledgers had grown too large to remain in the hands of a single family. To wrap the world like a web, to cross every border. They needed partners. The time had long come for the birth of that first global syndicate, built not with blood, but with gold. As the pages of the forbidden ledgers filled up, that dark power could no longer fit within the borders of Florence. The Medicis shined in Florence, but the gears of this massive financial machine had spread across the entire continent. They were not alone. They had established history's first and largest invisible consortium. This line, formed with the Fugger family rising in the German city of Augsburg and the Spinola clan holding overseas power in Genoa, was the BlackRock of the 15th century, perhaps even their ancestors. These families built an unaccountable center of power, far above states and kings. They were bound together not by bloodline, but by a flawless balance sheet tie. So, how did this syndicate work? Think of today's market manipulations. Just as giant funds control energy, microchips, or rare earth elements today, this cartel targeted the lifebloods of its era. The Medicis and their partners systematically shut down the alum mines one by one, which were vital for Europe's silver, copper, and especially textile industries. Without alum, fabric couldn't be dyed, and undyed fabric couldn't be sold. This meant shutting down the switch of one of the largest industries of the era. By controlling the supply, they created artificial scarcities. By manipulating prices, they brought markets to their knees. The armies of the aristocrats possessed physical weapons, but the raw materials for those weapons had now passed into the monopoly of this Council of Shadows. When a king wanted to raise an army, he needed not only gold, but also copper for that army's armor, and silver for its wages. And the key to these mines belonged to the Fugger family, the mining baron of this tri-syndicate. While kings thought they were swinging swords in the squares, they were actually acting as pawns in an algorithmic theater drawn for them by the bankers in Florence, Augsburg, and Genoa. Just as massive investment funds control global resources and energy lines today, this financial aristocracy network had taken the physical assets of the continent hostage 600 years ago. Those bloody pitched battles, those historical wars where thousands lost their lives. In the eyes of this consortium, they were not homeland defenses or heroic epics. These wars were, on a macro level, merely massive asset liquidation transactions. For them, wars were not a tragedy. Wars meant new loans and new mining concessions. Peace was not profitable for the owners of the system. War was a profitable revenue item. Feeding on the blood of Europe, the cartel had created the largest liquidity pool history had ever seen. However, they couldn't protect such a massive fortune and blackmail archive in wooden chests or simple locked rooms. The Medici's famous so-called passion for art would create its final and greatest illusion precisely at this point. Those massive Renaissance domes we look at with admiration in museums were actually about to be built as history's first cold wallets. That massive liquidity pool, overflowing with the blood and sweat of Europe, had grown too large to fit in wooden chests or ordinary iron safes in banks. Storing gold as an illusion in ledgers was not enough. Those physical assets, meaning thousands of crates of bullion, and the forbidden ledgers, required absolute secure storage. Those massive palaces and domes reaching to the sky that you see while walking the streets of Florence today. Do you think they were merely built as aesthetic masterpieces? Think again. For the Medicis, architectural structures were far beyond being works of art. They were the world's most secure, physical crypto rooms. The Medicis did not hire the genius architects of the era, such as Brunelleschi, the architect of the famous dome, simply to design buildings. Those genius minds were top-tier security engineers of the era, rather than mere artists. They built massive underground vaults into the foundations of these palaces and cathedrals that could only be opened with specific mechanical codes or secret keys. The cold wallet logic used by a digital currency investor today to protect their assets was carved into these marble walls 600 years ago. We are not talking about fiction, but real engineering espionage. Those innocent paintings and magnificent statues adorning the walls, the posture of certain statues, the hidden symbols on certain paintings actually house the entry mechanisms for these underground vaults or the maps for escape tunnels and hidden treasures. That dark corner the statue's finger pointed to was actually the entry coordinate of a massive fortune. When a noble wanted to commission a statue or a bust of himself for his house, his only thought wasn't his love for art, but the secret gold he hid within the artistic works to evade tax collectors. Those details we admire in museums were actually an encryption algorithm with various secrets hidden inside. While people were mesmerized by the grandeur they saw upon entering a palace, they could never understand that personal gold reserves were also hidden right inside those magnificent artworks. Art was not just a curtain laundering dirty money. It was also a high-security cover protecting that money from physical attacks. Today we encrypt our data. The Medicis encrypted their data in gold with architecture. That famous Renaissance is a great public relations effort to hide and even launder gold. Buildings had become safes, and art pieces the passwords to those safes. But to completely secure this massive system, to place Europe under an absolute monopoly, one final piece remained. The bank in Florence managed the continent's economy, but a total dominion could not be established without seizing the divine authority over the human soul. The Medicis set their sights on the largest, most untouchable, and wealthiest institution in Europe. They would bring down that sacred throne, not with a sword strike, but with what they did best, a flawless financial coup. For the Medicis, who turned architecture into massive vaults and art into the passwords for those vaults, only one target remained: sealing this economic power that crossed borders with a divine authority that ruled the human soul. They had brought earthly kings to their knees, but the ultimate monopoly could be established by seizing the institution that held the keys to heaven. The Vatican. The Medicis just waited for the right time. In the early 1400s, the Holy See was in complete chaos. The institution was divided. 3 different leaders claimed authority simultaneously, and the vault was completely empty. In the medieval system, where there is no money, faith weakens, and authority cracks. Right in the midst of this financial collapse, Giovanni de' Medici made the riskiest yet most ingenious investment in history. His target wasn't a clergyman. He was a professional pirate who plundered ships in the Mediterranean and stained trade routes with blood. Baldassare Cosa. But why a pirate? This decision, taken as a family around that dark table in Giovanni's dim office in Florence, wasn't the madness of a man blinded by arrogance. It was a flawless risk analysis. Because Giovanni knew that controlling a devout leader is difficult, but a man with a past full of crimes, ambitious, and owing everything to you, makes a perfect puppet. A faithful pope could only pray for the Medicis, but a sinful pope would be forced to be their absolute slave. The Medicis took on all of this pirate's debts and launched history's first major venture capital operation in his name. In Wall Street terms, that was a hostile takeover operation of an institution on the brink of bankruptcy. Gold worth millions of dollars in today's money was spent to buy cardinals, bribe armies, and cloak Cosa's bloody past in a holy silence. That dark past was flawlessly covered by Medici's golden curtains. This was no leap of faith. This was the purchase of an institution's highest peak by a bank. When that pirate sat on the most powerful seat in the world in 1410 thanks to Medici gold, the institution was no longer a holy place. It had become the largest branch of the bank in Florence. A man who had shed blood with his sword, until that day would now execute asset liquidations for the Medicis with his papal ring. The Medicis hadn't just bought a leader, but also the divine authority and tax collection power beneath that position. The operation was complete. Now they were the bankers of God. Giovanni de' Medici had successfully managed the hostile takeover process. Now every tithe, every confession fee, and every sacred donation paid to the church flowed through the marble halls of the Vatican directly into the ledgers of the Medici Bank in Florence. The Vatican was no longer just a center of faith. It was the most profitable branch of the Medici Bank. They had tied the world's largest collection network to their own balance sheets under the veil of religion. The family was now financing not only kings and armies, but the eternal fate of millions of people. But they wouldn't stop. The divine immunity this holy seat provided them would throw wide open the doors to the deadliest tool they would use to access information: history's first global wiretapping agency. When Baldassare Cosa, whose pirate past was erased with gold, was declared pope, the largest piece on the chessboard was now under Medici control. However, for those minds calculating in their dim offices in Florence, gold was merely a tool, an illusion used to govern the masses. The real target was a power far more permanent, far sharper than gold: information. Utilizing the absolute immunity provided by this holy seat, the Medicis established history's first global intelligence network, the Shadow Post. In the Middle Ages, borders between kingdoms were sharp and dangerous. Soldiers blocked roads, caravans were searched, envoys were interrogated. However, there was one seal that no king soldier had the authority to stop or search: a courier carrying it, the papal seal. By dressing their own intelligence agents in the robes of the church, the Medicis had created a flawless diplomatic shield capable of breaching all borders in Europe. Under the protection of the Vatican, every intimate letter, every diplomatic note traveling from one end of Europe to the other, stopped at the Medici's data mining center in Florence. Before reaching its true destination, kings thought they were secretly making deals with each other while communicating under the protection of the Holy Seat's seal, thinking their private correspondence could not be seen due to the protection granted to kingdoms by the Vatican privilege. However, those letters were intercepted in the dead of night by specially trained priests and Medici clerks. Seals were opened with special techniques by heating the wax. The contents were copied with flawless speed, and then they were resealed and sent to their destination as if they had never been touched. These copied, vital data were then logged into that famous blackmail archive known as the Forbidden Ledgers. Which king's correspondence with his secret mistress, which duke's secret bankruptcy plans, all were in the hands of the Medicis. This was such a network that before a war even began, the outcome was determined in Florence. Because the secret plans of both sides lay on a single table right in front of the Medicis. Just as giant technology companies today turn us into algorithmic marketing objects, by processing our messages, digital footprints, and data, the Medicis turned kings, nobles, and princes into flawless blackmail subjects 600 years ago. Information flowed faster than gold, and thanks to the Vatican, the Medicis became the bankers not only of God but of the vulnerabilities possessed by humans. This was exactly what perfected the system. When a debt wasn't paid or when a king clashed with Medici interests, the debt collectors didn't ask him for money. They coldly slammed that king's darkest secret, his most intimate letter, onto the table. Every castle that couldn't be bought with gold was conquered from within through blackmail. However, at the peak of the arrogance, where they thought they controlled everything, something they encountered in the darkest, centuries untouched vaults of the Vatican would freeze the Medici's blood. They would realize that while building this massive system, they were actually only following the footsteps of a much older and far more dangerous ghost. The Medicis had bought kings, seized the keys to the Vatican, and altered the financial genetics of Europe. The Medicis were at the peak of their power, holding the throne and the data in their hands. However, there was one question keeping Giovanni and his son Cosimo awake. Why was everything progressing so flawlessly while they were making moves on the chessboard? Why were their rivals eliminated one by one? Why was every obstacle in their path seemingly cleared by an invisible hand? This feeling of protection they felt at the peak of their power dragged them to the deepest, centuries-sealed, forbidden archives of the Vatican. What they sought among those dark, cold corridors wasn't a fortune, but the secret of their own existence. However, when the Medicis, who had the right to access the deepest archives of the seat, where no one had the authority to enter, infiltrated the forbidden archives of the Vatican with the special permission of the Pope, the documents they encountered changed everything. As they deciphered the encrypted correspondence hidden within the parchments among the dusty shelves, the Medicis realized a terrifying truth. They hadn't built their own empire. Someone had cleared the path for their growth, granted privileges, and pushed them forward as the shadow financiers of a much larger capital. Giovanni's son Cosimo came across documents sealed with blood among the oldest parchments. This belonged to that massive shadow erased from history a century before them. The Knights Templar. The Medicis realized in those dusty vaults that this tremendous financial system they had built, those ingenious currency illusions, actually didn't belong to them. The documents and correspondence in the archive laid bare the Templars' invisible shadow banking logic stretching from Jerusalem to Paris in all its nakedness. What business could the Vatican have with the Templars? As they read the letters hidden in the most intimate parts of the archive for days, the Medicis began to understand what kind of puzzle they were a part of. The Medicis hadn't invented the system. They were merely mimicking a monster that had retreated underground. But how could this be? That massive fortune of the Templars, which indebted all of Europe and vanished overnight, wasn't just made of gold. That fortune was the secret financial codes, written on how gold should be managed. These codes were given to the Medicis, and they thought they were only using these codes for their own interests. But where had the true owners of these codes hidden those sealed secrets in the dark labyrinths of the world? The legacy was much older, and the enemies far more dangerous. The Medicis now spent most of their days reading the Vatican's forbidden ledgers. A mysterious letter discovered in the darkness of the archive whispered the name that would shake all of history. The letter belonged to a power far older than themselves, a formation hiding behind the foggy curtains of history. In ink resembling centuries-old dried blood, the lines read exactly like this: "To the Grand Master of the Council of Shadows. As you commanded, our annual earnings of 1,400 chests of gold have been buried in the locations you indicated on the map." Council of Shadows. The Medicis were frozen. Who were they? What kind of power was this that could remain completely invisible for centuries? Who was this structure that was even higher than kings, nobles, and the church itself? And most importantly, who were those shadows they called master of a military and financial power that brought the world to its knees like the Knights Templar? The deepest archives of the Vatican were revealing a terrifying truth. And the Medicis hadn't even gone to the deepest parts yet. The secret codes containing secrets within secrets had frozen the blood of even the master of trickery, the Medicis. That massive fortune of 1,400 chests of gold buried in those years. And where were those maps hidden that showed where that gold was? Maps that would change the course of history. The Medicis buried their gold in marble palaces. But the true owners of the system, where did they take that great secret and that massive treasure with them? On that dark Friday the 13th morning, when they vanished overnight. The seals of the Templars remain unbroken, and the map of that buried gold is still waiting to be deciphered somewhere. Now we return to where it all began, to the first seals of that dark army, and to that great secret hidden in the vaults of Jerusalem. In the next file, the Knights Templar, the treasure of Jerusalem. Follow the shadows, because the truth is much deeper and much older than you think.